everyone, welcome back to APUSH. Today we're going to be looking at Key Concept 8.2.1, all about the civil rights movement during the 20th century. So, the focus of this lecture is more just the African American civil rights movement, thinking about from the early 1950s up until about 1965, before the movement starts to change and have influences elsewhere within America as well. So it's the way we're kind of looking at this is a pretty clean narrative of this major part of history. Here we go. All right, so the first thing we need to touch on a little bit is just a review of what the situation was like in the United States after World War II, dealing with civil rights, and especially Jim Crow in the South. Now, if you remember going back to the end of the 19th century, we had Plessy versus Ferguson, this decision by the Supreme Court that said that separate but equal was the law of the land. And what this did is this created that the time period, more or less from the end of Reconstruction up until the Civil Rights Movement, was this nadir of race relations, this very low point when basically institutional racism was the law of the land in a way. How did this materialize? Poll taxes, literacy tests, different ways to limit civil rights, especially voting rights for African Americans. Okay. Meanwhile, in the North, just so you know, it's not like segregation didn't exist in the North. It's not that the Civil War and Reconstruction ended racial discrimination up there too. It just wasn't as bad. That's the reason that many African Americans moved into northern cities during the Great Migration, but at the same time, those shift in demographics caused an increase in violence in northern cities and many race riots as well. So just keep that in mind, that segregation has been going on for decades at this point, and it really hasn't improved much. Now, World War II can be considered a little bit of a turning point in Black history, because what was happening is many more African Americans were participating in the war effort and felt like engaged citizens. The war, basically this total war situation, made it so it was required for everyone to participate, which meant that in some ways society kind of stepped back on segregation and that institutionalized racism for a little bit in order to allow a victory in World War II. But that had unintended consequences sort of in the African American mentality. They looked at what was happening and said, doesn't this mean that if we can be desegregated and if we can be involved in our country during this time, why can't it happen during peacetime as well? Okay, we saw what happened with racism and the Holocaust with Nazis, which means that, well, if that's our enemy, why do we have instances of these same sort of limitations of laws like Jim Crow, similar to the Nuremberg laws? It was kind of this point where the inconsistencies of freedom in America came to light, and it's during World War II in this context that a budding civil rights movement starts to form. Some steps forward, the Executive Order 8802 that we talked about during World War II, desegregating wartime industries, which of course was created because of pressure put on FDR by the Black community threatening a march on Washington. This was part of the Double V campaign, the idea of victory abroad, victory at home, regarding civil rights, and it's during this context when the Congress of Racial Equality formed. So one of these early civil rights organizations that will continue to exist in the civil rights movement proper. Now, after this, we're moving into the Cold War, and suddenly there's this mentality in America, just like with World War II, that we were fighting a world evil. This time it was set up that the world evil was communism with the Soviet Union. And because there's this dichotomy between our values and their values, it meant that there was this feeling that we needed to prove that that freedom could lead to more equality before the law, and so a couple things happened there. One of these was that Harry Truman, the new president after FDR died right at the end of World War II, desegregated the military, and I already mentioned this before dealing with the Korean War, that was the first military engagement we were involved in where the armed forces were desegregated and ever after. Okay, so you can see, when there's a little bit of popular pressure, when there's this social mentality and value system involved, the government will take steps to look like it's doing, like it's making progress. keep that idea in mind when we get onto a slide a couple on from now as to why would the federal government take actions to promote civil rights and curtail segregation. All right, so there's our context. Let's continue with what happens with the beginning of the civil rights movement as we know it. So, what we've got going on here is, if you look at the left, major leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. fighting through nonviolent protest tactics. So that's really what we're looking at on this slide, is examples in this timeline, this narrative of nonviolent protest tactics. So you're going to see more of this in class through some videos and a timeline that we're going to create as well that's going to help to visualize it. All right, so oftentimes when we study the civil rights movement, we talk about nonviolent protest, we start in the mid-1950s with the Montgomery Bus Boycott and Rosa Parks. So this is probably a story that you know from before, that Rosa Parks was riding the bus. Buses and public transportation were segregated in Montgomery, Alabama. She refused to give up her seat and was arrested and basically became the poster child for this fight against segregation in general, but also specifically in public transportation. Now, what happened is the local chapter of the NAACP was already looking to organize a bus boycott. So they'd had some other candidates before, but their sort of personal reputation would have made a court case difficult for having that person as this this sort of paragon of kind of an upright standing. Rosa Parks was just that. So, yes, she was a seamstress, but she also worked for the NAACP. She'd had training in nonviolent protest tactics. So, even though it seemed her action was kind of on her own, her ideas were very much already aligned to this this bus boycott that was trying to be organized in the process. So, how did this work? Well, essentially, the NAACP hires Martin Luther King Jr. to organize this boycott. They needed a charismatic, very gifted leader to come in and organize everything. Organization is a major reason that the civil rights movement in this period had successes. So what happened is the black community in Montgomery just stopped using the buses, and they made up, I think, over 2/3 or 3/4 of the people who were using the buses. So what happened? It lasted 13 months. What did they do instead? They had carpools. They walked to work. Some people, walking 10, 15 miles to work for 13 months in every season possible. Now, I want you to keep this in mind, that the only way that that can be successful is if people really believe in it, that they have a reason and investment in it happening. And it worked. On top of that, it kind of crippled the local economy because eventually they start to boycott other businesses. And eventually Montgomery has to respond and say, we're not making any money on public transportation. We need to desegregate in order to keep our government solvent. So it works that way, and eventually it goes up to the Supreme Court to desegregate public transportation nationwide. So why is this significant? It's the first major success in steps to end legalized segregation in the South, and it also puts Martin Luther King Jr. on the national stage. So he's actually a well-known name rather than just, a minister in his late 20s. What else did this do? It established one of the major organizations that leads much of the civil rights movement, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is a really important one to know, and also just what it stands for, because it tells you what their congregation was somewhat like. It was an organization sort of directed through black churches in the South. Okay, and then those churches were used in a political and social way to get more people involved, kind of like a grassroots organization to get people involved in a larger movement from the bottom up. Okay, elsewhere in America, there are other organizations forming as well, and a good example of this is what happened with the sit-ins organized by college students. So the group behind this was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the way we pronounce it is SNCC. So not SNCC, we say SNCC. And they use colleges as a venue for organizing young people to get involved in the movement as well. One of their major sort of steps forward and strategies they used were sit-ins. So basically lunch counters back then were kind of like the way to get fast food. They would be attached to drugstores or grocery stores. And it was a place to get a sandwich, to get lunch really quickly. They were segregated, though. what happened is black people would have to go around to the back door and basically get the food kind of to go in a way. They weren't allowed to eat at the restaurant. And it seemed kind of minor, but in the same way that SNCC said, this is a good step forward to attack a minor issue and then move on to segregation at large. So what did they do? They would come into these lunch counters, they would sit down, and they would basically say, I would like to order some food. They would be denied service, but they would refuse to leave. And if they were told to leave, they would just say, I just want to order some food. I just want to order some food, to make it clear that they were being nonviolent, kind of nonviolent civil disobedience. What happened is many were arrested, so the police would be called in and would arrest them for disorderly conduct, but it was such a movement organized at the colleges that they would have a whole new group of college students to come in and take the place of the ones arrested. The police really didn't know what to do, because every time they arrested students, more would come in, and more would come in, and more would come in. Okay? Another thing about this tactic is it, in a way, forced whites to be violent in the face of nonviolence. So they were sitting there just saying, I just want to order some food, being peaceful, not causing a ruckus. But what happened is whites would come in and try to intimidate them, eventually leading to verbal and physical abuse. Now, you would think at that point that the police would arrest the people doing the abuse, but they would then arrest the black students instead. And when this is filmed and this is put out in the media through the news, it became clear to many people around the nation that, hey, all they want to do is order some food. Why can't the South let them do that? And it eventually leads kind of in a city-by-city movement to the desegregation of the lunch counters and restaurants. Okay? Something to know, these students went through training, like I mentioned with Rosa Parks before, to prepare for this violence they would face. You'll see this in the movie that we're going to watch in class, and that'll be helpful. All right, so at this point, we've got SCLC, we've got SNCC, we've got two major organizations that are having successes using nonviolent protest tactics. SNCC is the younger group, SCLC is the older group. Eventually, they decide to team up to tackle a city-by-city way of desegregating the South. And they said, if there's one place where we're going to have the most ardent resistance, it's going to be in Birmingham, one of the most segregated cities in the South, Birmingham, Alabama. Okay, very large city in Alabama. So they teamed up. They had some other campaigns as well in Albany and Georgia, Selma as well. And basically they decided we're going to go in and replicate these nonviolent tactics. Okay, so that would involve sit-ins, that would involve refusing to get up on transportation, it would involve sort of protests, not going to certain businesses to buy things. It would involve, what else? Picketing, so holding signs, having marches. But what happened instead is a lot of these other places weren't as extreme in their tactics against the civil rights protesters. Birmingham was, and these protesters faced fire hoses. We're talking about, hoses that are meant to shoot water a huge distance, that have huge amounts of PSI, which means when it hits you, it's going to cause you to have your skin ripped, to have bruises and internal bleeding. Police dogs were sent to attack the protesters, and what this did is it was so extreme, it got on the news and it got public attention, where the rest of the country started saying, wow, it's really coming to this, where nonviolent protesters are being attacked with dogs and fire hoses, hoses that can rip bark off of trees. It got public attention and eventually led to Birmingham agreeing to desegregate their public facilities. Okay, let's see. Another thing about Birmingham is the children's march. What happened is a lot of adults were participating, but as they got arrested, suddenly they weren't able to go to work. They couldn't provide for their family anymore. So what they said is, hey, let's have children involved in the protest. Children can miss a couple days of school and it's not going to cause a huge difference, but if adults go to jail, they might not be able to pay their rent, their mortgage, their anything to provide for their family. So you can see Birmingham was this all-out assault on segregation through all the different things that had existed before. It's kind of this merging of the movements, and that's why it was so large, and it had some successes despite all these setbacks through the resistance from white supremacy in the South. We're going to focus a lot on kind of the timeline of Birmingham and just how important it was in the civil rights movement in class. We'll make a timeline out of it. Okay, so that's kind of the beginning that we just looked at of using these nonviolent tactics and creating a movement. But a reason why a lot of these grassroots movements were eventually successful is not just because they pressured local governments to do things, but they knew they had to go up to the highest level, the federal government, to get anything done, to make it a law instead of just a local law, federal law instead of local law. So we're going to look at steps forward used through the federal government. Okay, one of the early steps forward and one of the biggest ones was the Brown versus Board of Education decision in the Supreme Court. Now, it challenged segregation in schools, and one of the lawyers involved was Thurgood Marshall. It's a good name to know. He's going to become a Supreme Court justice later on in the late 1960s, and he was the very first black person to serve as a Supreme Court justice. Okay, now, this is one of the few Supreme Court cases you need to know things about it by name. Okay, it's one of the 3 mentioned in the curriculum, and one of the reasons it's so important is it overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson said separate but equal is constitutional. Brown versus Board of Education took a play on those words, and in the majority opinion, it said that separate is inherently unequal. And what's really interesting about Brown versus Board of Education is it did something that Supreme Court rulings don't usually do. Oftentimes, if you look at like Dred Scott, it just says, here is why this is legal. It's because of the Constitution, A, B, and C, very rational and ordered. It doesn't really provide social commentary. The authors of Brown versus Board of Education did that. Earl Warren, okay, he was the Chief Justice at the time. And what it said is that separate is inherently unequal, and by having the system as we had it, it's setting it up so that there will be increasing differences between the races socially years on. So basically it said that justice and educational equality and future social equality was being denied to a section of the population just in order to seem like it was constitutional. And it basically said we can't deny the future their potential just for those reasons. Right? Now, major step forward in theory, not in practice, because those southern states that now were being forced to integrate their schools completely resisted. The best example here was what happened at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. The school refused to integrate. So what it did at first is it just used their National Guard, their kind of state troopers, to prevent the kids from going in. The governor was then kind of convinced by the president that he had to let them come in. So he said, okay, I'm just not going to have the National Guard there. And you have instances of people yelling, lynch the students. And Eisenhower, the president, realized something has to be done to force Southerners and the schools to accept that this is the law. So what did he do? He sent in the military, sent in the National Guard to occupy this high school and force them to let these 9 students go to school. Okay, we'll learn more about it in class with the video and get kind of actually sort of first-person perspectives from some of the students who were involved in this at the time. Now, what you need to understand about this fact that the schools were so reluctant to integrate was that the civil rights movement is only successful when the federal government is willing to enforce those laws. Laws are completely purposeless if no one follows them. Think back to, like prohibition in the 1920s. It was the law, no one followed it, so was it really a law? The Supreme Court can say that schools have to be desegregated, but if the schools won't do it and the federal government won't enforce those laws, then it might as well not be a law, and segregation is still the law of the land. Okay, so keep that in mind. School segregation has a very mixed legacy, because even up to today, if we look at what happened, is even though segregation of schools is illegal, it still happens through de facto segregation. I can talk about that more in class if you want. All right, so other things that happened is convincing the federal government to support it. A big movement here was the March on Washington that happened in August 1963 after the Birmingham campaign. So what it meant is the movement often figured out, especially with the South, that we can go city by city, Albany, Birmingham, Montgomery, and try to desegregate everything, but those are just local laws. They're not even state laws. we need to make our movement a national movement by going to the federal capital and having a giant march. March? Well, it is a march. March was the word I was trying to say. The federal government supported it, so yes, it was this movement that really kind of showed how extensive the civil rights movement could be, but the federal government was already moving in that direction anyway. Okay, that's what I was saying about they need government support in order to make it really happen. So 250,000 people descended on Washington, D.C. to fight for jobs and legal equality. The sort of most memorable thing from the march is Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. So you're gonna see this in class a little bit. Just know that it was never meant to be sort of the central speech or the central part of the march, but it has since emerged because of the power of the language that he uses in it, bringing it from just a case-by-case desegregation effort to a larger idea of what America could be if equality was achieved. Now, one of the things they were fighting for with this march was a Civil Rights Act of Congress. The idea of Congress actually passing a law that says public facilities have to be desegregated. Now, President Kennedy, JFK, did promote this during Birmingham because of the violence he saw there, and he said, I'm going to put pressure on Congress to get this through so that we end segregation legally at a federal level. Now, JFK was killed in 1963, assassinated, so the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was now in charge of this, and he wanted this to be his legacy. Even though he was a Southerner, even though he grew up as a Southern Democrat amidst segregation, he actually worked as a teacher within black and Mexican schools at the time, and he saw firsthand just how horrible segregation was in its effect on people for their potential in the future. So, even though he was a Southerner, he said, I'm going to make connections in Congress and really pressure them to get this done. It is passed in 1964. This is where our timeline is going to end that we're going to make in class. It outlawed discrimination in public facilities, so restaurants, bathrooms, all those sorts of things, based on race, gender, origin, religion, and it had enforcement. That's the important part. Usually enforcement is incumbent upon the executive branch, but this law says that Congress gets some of the enforcement too. And how is it going to enforce it? By saying, if you don't desegregate, we will not give your state federal money that you would have gotten otherwise. And guess what happens? Most southern states get into line because they want the money. Okay? So, that's a major step because of everything we've seen so far with the civil rights movement, but the civil rights leaders were saying it's not enough because things are desegregated, but African Americans still don't really have a voice in what happens in their own states. And they said, how can we do that? Tackle the issue of voting rights. Civil rights were somewhat achieved through that law, but voting rights were a part that was part of the law that never got put into it. LBJ took it out because he knew the South would never support it. So what do? They say, first step, have all the civil rights organizations go into Mississippi and run a voter registration drive. This is called Freedom Summer. Had a lot of both black and white college students from the North coming into the South in order to register black people to vote and find ways to make it happen. Now, they got violent retaliation from Southern white supremacists with murder. So some of these college kids were killed, tortured, brutalized, and that showed the resistance that was continuing in the South. Now, eventually there is one civil rights marcher that was killed. His name was Jimmy Lee Jackson, and what that led to was a march. The idea was to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, and it was a protest, a march. It was about, how long was it? About 60 miles or so to fight for voting rights. But what happened is the governor of Alabama was this guy, George Wallace, the guy that said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, okay? And what he says is, I don't want them marching, I don't want them coming to my capital and causing me sort of public pressure, because that forced me to desegregate transportation in the past. So what he does is he brings out the state troopers to stop the marchers before they basically get through town, get over a bridge, and he wanted to stop them there. So when the marchers got to the other side of the bridge, they were met by state troopers with tear gas, mounted on horses with gas masks and billy clubs, and this gets to be known as Bloody Sunday. You'll see a video. I'll show you a video of it in class. Okay. Well, what happens is they said, "Turn around now, or we're gonna have to attack you," pretty much. And these marchers were they were brave and they had a commitment. They kept walking forward anyway, and they get beat back. It's absolutely horrible to watch. And that's important though. It was filmed, it was televised, and it basically interrupted just the normal programming that was on TV that night on every major network to say, look what the South is doing. And it basically put the South in this position like, what do we do? It led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that banned literacy tests. Previously, the 24th Amendment had been passed to ban poll taxes, which means that you see a huge increase in black votership, which is another step forward to not just having legal rights that are being enforced, but to having a voice in who your representatives are and what you're able to get done through your actions, not just government action. That was a long one, guys, but it's a lot of important stuff. All right, so what we're getting at here is our last slide, and it's important to talk about. So oftentimes when we talk about the civil rights movement, we usually end with Selma, 1965, where we got to. It's a really clean narrative where you go from the Montgomery Bus Boycott, talk about nonviolent sort of grassroots protesting movements, successes, getting the federal government involved to pass laws, successes, having setbacks, but then getting voting rights out of this as well. It's huge. But after 1965, as it says on the left, not everything was working. Okay, the South was still resisting desegregation. Housing desegregation hadn't really been addressed. And you get some issues of some black Americans saying what's being done with nonviolence is not enough. They question its efficacy, and we see kind of a divergent civil rights movement after 1965 and onward that kind of goes right in with kind of this era of conflict in the 1960s and 1970s that we're going to talk about in a different lecture. So, because the movement faced those problems and even after legal successes, the movement evolves, okay? We see political changes, but not changes in social views. And what happened in many cities is there were riots, race riots, because economic and social equality was not achieved through changes in political rights. Here are some of the movements that develop as a result of this lack of, in the mind of some, true progress. One was black nationalism. So this is just the idea of having more pride in being black and black culture and not wanting to assimilate or integrate into white society. Now, this ties into something we studied before with Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. Those ideas existed back then. They're existing again in the wake of the success and sort of lack of sort of economic and social strides forward of the civil rights movement. What people that believed in this would say is, I'm proud to be black, okay? And this is actually the moment when African Americans started calling themselves black instead of calling themselves Negroes. Before this, both whites and blacks called black people Negroes. And black nationalism said, why should we be calling ourselves the same thing that our oppressors are calling us? We're black, we're just going to call ourselves black. Okay, that's where this came from. Okay, and they said that there really wasn't the chance for white society to truly accept them, so they needed to live a little bit separately and have pride in what they had and not adapting to what existed with white culture and mainstream society already. Another element of this was the Nation of Islam. So this is very popular among urban black people. So the idea of people living in cities, not really having kind of that connection to the churches that people in small towns in the South did, and they converted to Islam instead. But the Nation of Islam is a group within Islam as a whole that specifically kind of geared towards black Americans and kind of black sort of unity. The major figure from this is Malcolm X. He looked at what Martin Luther King Jr. was doing and he said, that's great, okay? If you can get things done with nonviolence, cool. But he said, what I've seen is nonviolence isn't completely working. And he had this phrase that it would be, sort of great to get things done with the ballot by voting. But if you can't get it done with the ballot, then it's okay to resort to bullets. So he often gets sort of kind of pigeonholed. People say, oh, he was in favor of violence. That's not really what he was saying. He was saying that if the police, if white supremacists are violent against us, we shouldn't feel the need to have to be nonviolent. We should fight back. Okay? He was assassinated in 1965 by someone from within the Nation of Islam. So he eventually gets kind of kicked out of there because he wasn't, how do I say this? He wasn't perfectly going along with their views and started to develop his own views. But he represents a leader within the civil rights movement that kind of acts as a foil to Martin Luther King Jr., who only advocated nonviolence. They only met like once in their entire life. There's one picture of them together, but they often had to talk about each other because they knew we're both fighting for the same thing, but we differ on how that's going to be achieved. What this gets back to is some pushes for civil rights before. If you think of people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. In many ways, Malcolm X is more like Du Bois. King is more like Booker T. Washington in that way, talking about quick or gradual change. All right? Oh, by the way, his name Malcolm X. So his birth name was Malcolm Little, but he changed his last name to X because he was saying, I don't know what my ancestors' last name actually was because that was stripped from them by being slaves. So that's why the X is there. Okay, it was basically within the Nation of Islam that they all took the last name X to represent sort of having that identity taken away from them. Okay, other movements within this, the Black Power movement, this develops out of a more radical wing of SNCC. Stokely Carmichael was a leader of SNCC at one point, but what he started to see is that SCLC was only wanting to use nonviolent methods. SNCC, kind of these young Turks, these younger groups that are saying we don't want to go along with the older generation, split with them and develop into a more radical organization. They kick out all white members, and it starts to go into those idea of black nationalism rather than cooperation. Okay, so pride in being black, desire to strengthen black communities. So you see how a lot of these have things in common. Now, one of the more radical groups that developed later on was the Black Panther Party. Okay, they were kind of black nationalists that focused on black separatism. They thought that it was impossible for them to work within the white communities, so they said, we're already segregated, why don't we just use our people to police and defend our own people, because they did not trust the police. Something that's kind of crazy, actually, is one of the things that triggers a lot more interest in gun rights in America in the late 1960s through the 80s had to do with the Black Panthers and how they would be armed. They actually knew sort of what the laws were about how they could and where they could use guns, and they followed them very specifically, and they would be carrying loaded rifles down the street. They knew they had to be like 20 feet away from people being arrested, but what they would do is they would stand 20 feet away and just stare down the police who were arresting black people. And the police were like, what do I do? And they'd say, you can't do that. And they would say, well, we're 20 feet away from the arrest, so we're within our rights to do this. That, in a way, sort of triggered this fear of black people having guns, and it got a lot more interest in people arming themselves as well. Okay? Now, a place that will end here has to do with how Martin Luther King Jr.'s views started to shift as well. He said, yes, we made great progress with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, with nonviolence, with public pressure to attack the lack of political rights. But then he started to turn his focus on the lack of economic equality. And he started attacking the Vietnam War for the disproportionate amount of black Americans being killed compared to the black population in America. Now, the FBI was already watching him and surveilling him very closely, but because he was doing things the government was willing to support, they didn't go after him as much. Once he did this, they were still surveilling him, but they really stopped protecting him from anything. And that resulted in him being assassinated in April 1968. In Memphis, Tennessee, when he was on another campaign trying to give speeches to promote economic equality. And you can see when the government doesn't support you, you're not going to be protected. And that's why two major leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Were assassinated, because the government did not support their views and was unwilling to protect them anymore. All right, thanks for watching as always. You know what your next steps are. You've got some term cards to create, a quiz to do, geography to work on, chronology to study, and another video to watch if you're ready to do so. So this is Mr. Chodola. Thanks for watching as always, and I'll see you in class. Bye.